Got your back now.
All right. So we are the guys of the class. So we did the self-assessment of loneliness amongst men attending Northern Virginia Community College. I'm Nick. These are my guys. Maybe you want to introduce yourselves?
Hey, I'm Joe Sue. I'm Kyani, Alcin.
I'm Cressey. All right. So why we chose to study loneliness? Well, why we chose it is because when I first came to Nova, I noticed it was a lot different than high school. There was a lot more tight-knit social groups than there was in high school, because instead of being forced to be at school all day, you could come to school, take your classes, and leave. So it felt like some of the students who, had to get rides from their parents or stuff would just be sitting by themselves, not actually engaging with anybody. So after we decided that that's what we were going to study, the second reason that we chose to do it is because when we actually went into the literature, we found out there wasn't that much on it. So that was our second major issue that wasn't currently being addressed well enough. So after that, we were going to gather more information and then see if we could further the study at all. And our hypothesis was there's a large percentage of male students attending Northern Virginia Community College who will see themselves as lonely.
All right. So the literature was amazing, and when we said it didn't really hit on our topic, we didn't mean it didn't have a lot about loneliness, because there was a ridiculous amount about loneliness. But the issue was we wanted something specific about men, and that didn't happen. It was like looking for a needle in a haystack, and we didn't quite manage to get that needle. So just to talk about a couple of the studies, one of the best ones we had there was Singh from 1991, and the study itself found out some really good key points. And the first is something that we had to combat ourselves as we did the study, which is there's a cultural view of loneliness, that it's a bad and a wrong thing. You shouldn't be lonely. You shouldn't ever feel lonely. You should feel happy and with company. And it's interesting, you always contrast it with happiness as opposed to sadness. It's loneliness and happiness. It also tends that young people are the loneliest of all of the people. It was originally thought that the elderly would have most of the difficulty, but as it turns out, most of it happens in the young ages. And often people marry and get divorced based on how they feel, based on their loneliness levels. According to another study, a lot of people actually don't look for an answer for their loneliness. For some reason, along with the culture accepting that it's a bad thing, they also just accept that it is a thing as opposed to looking for a solution to it. And I suppose in a way people who get married have tried to find a solution, but typically people don't look for one. Also, perceiving loneliness was heavily based on emotional intelligence, and that the stronger you are in emotional intelligence, the easier it is to not have difficulty with loneliness. Interestingly enough, men have an issue with loneliness because their emotional intelligence also tends to be lower. When students were asked what psychological issues they needed help with most, anxiety and loneliness came up together there. And the relationship between that was very interesting. A lot of people who are lonely tend to be anxious. And also there was a relationship between loneliness and depression. A lot of people who felt lonely were depressed, and a lot of people who were depressed felt completely secluded and alone in themselves. And talking about just some of the methods used in providing the research that we got, the most prolific form of study that they used was a survey. And as we ourselves looked at it, it was interesting that the survey provides a lot of data very quickly. Unfortunately, it was part of the reason we had an issue looking into the literature in the first place, because surveys tend to leave out the depth of the information. Though they have a lot of information, it's kind of meh. It sits on top there without actually giving any meat to the issue. And the other option we found that was often used was a mixed method, so that they would start with a survey, they would often then spark a conversation afterwards and actually try and get some real deep information out of that.
All right, so I'm going to talk about our research method. So instead of analyzing it, we use an explication process that was established by Heisner. He avoids the term analysis simply because it means breaking it into parts, whereas explication is investigating the constituents of the phenomenon while keeping the context as a whole. So the first step we have is bracketing and phenomenological reduction. This isn't to be confused with bracketing such as in interviews where the information is bracketed for the interviewee. It's actually a bracketing of the researcher's presuppositions and their theoretical concepts before they do the research. So they don't want to allow the researcher's own meanings and interpretations to enter the world of the interviewee before we interview them. And then you delineate the units of meaning. This is a really critical process in the explication because so in this step, any outstanding statements from interviewees that shed light on the phenomenon are extracted and isolated. And so once you isolate those, you want to scrutinize it and remove the redundant units, so the statements or units. And then once you have non-redundant units, you want to cluster the units to form a theme. Heisner remarks that this calls for more judgment and skill on the researcher's part. So in this step, the researcher is engaged in something that cannot be precisely delineated. But after step 3, we move on to step 4, and you summarize each interview and validate it. So we did a validity check where we go back to the interviewees and we make sure that the information that we got from them it captures the essence of what we want. And then you extract the general themes and unique themes from all the interviews, and you make a composite summary. Care has to be taken into this process because the common themes and significant differences do exist, and you want to point out the unique and minority voices because they prove really important counterpoints for a phenomenon. And moving on,
next slide, which is the explication and findings, and we had used a purposive sampling design, which means that we would be interviewing multiple people, but the only condition would be that they were male and they were attending the campus of Nova. And as for the explication process itself, our team had separated the subjects into 2 separate groups. The first group would be men who were single, and the second group would be if you were in a relationship of some kind. And even though they were asked multiple different questions, we focused mostly on 4 specific questions. And these 4 were, the first one was that their basic definition of loneliness. And a majority of group 1 answers, they were more deep, and they focused more on as if you were removed from society, as if you couldn't connect with the group. And this was contrasted by group 2, who was in a relationship, who, their answers, they were generally pretty simple. They're just, okay, it's being alone. But where they did narrow into, it was more that, okay, they don't have someone to go home to. They don't have someone who they can have a rich conversation with, that's a strong connection to them. And the second question was, it was based off of their time management. And group 2, most of their time management was based off of, they focused most of their time at Nova. One subject stated that they spend 70% of the time. But the first group, it was pretty much even. They maybe spent 20 hours at home, school, and work. The third question focused on the amount of drugs or alcohol that each subject would have consumed. And group 1 stated that they had consumed no alcohol or drugs, except for one subject who stated they may have had maybe 2 beers with his father. But group 2 stated that they drank a lot. And one subject stated that when I asked him a question, he laughed and said, "I couldn't actually tell you how much, because I don't count anymore." And the final question asked was whether the subject had been involved in any clubs or teams during high school. And while both groups did mention track, the differences came when group 1 mentioned that they were involved in reading club, anime club, and the technology student association. While group 2, they mostly focused on football, baseball, and theater. And the big difference with that, at least that was from education, was that in group 1, the events that they went to, they were mostly clubs where like-minded people could come together and talk about something. While group 2, they focused more on a bunch of people coming together and completing a task that required everyone to do a specific motion. The next slide. And for our conclusion, one of the gaps in our research was our choice of study. Because it was a phenomenological study, the data collected, it wouldn't be as simple as you could take some data and then measure it. It would have to be fully understood. And it's not really an issue, but it's more the fact that it would take so much time to go into each individual interview and get the full understanding of what they said through each interview. It would be slightly difficult. And there's also the fact that the questions asked, they were tested before, but let's just say that someone took the question in and their interpretation was different than our original intention. That if that happened, then their answer would be very different than what we expected, and then everyone would be a little confused because we don't know what they're talking about, they don't know. It's just a big issue overall. But the key findings of the study were that there was a clear difference between the two groups. That groups 1 answers to the definition of loneliness were deeper, and that was to be expected because they would have been the single group, and that if they were lonely, it would be more focused on, okay, they're already there. While group 2, they're in a relationship, so the question may be kind of odd, because if they were already separated into a separate group, they're thinking, why would I be asked a loneliness question if I'm with someone already and I'm not lonely? And our hypothesis statement that a majority of men attending Nova would see themselves as lonely was proven incorrect, just because out of all the people who asked, only one person specifically stated that they were lonely. So it was proven incorrect, and we're going to further study.
In further study, we wanted to look at what we'd actually gotten from our study and what we ended up with. Technically speaking, we didn't get what we were looking for at all. We were looking for a particular percentage of males at Nova who felt lonely. Only the issue at hand was that all of them had felt lonely, and only one actually felt lonely at the point we were speaking to them. The individual actually was someone who was struggling with depression, clinical depression. So unfortunately, that kind of throws the balance off. Even the one we had wasn't really the one we were looking for. When we look at that, we looked at it, we had the wrong question in mind when we were looking at it, and we wouldn't have known if we hadn't done the study. Because one of the big things we discovered was that all of them understood loneliness to a degree, and all of them had experienced it. And they had a passive understanding that the loneliness was a temporary event, and it shouldn't be longer. And if it is long and it is not temporary, that's when issues begin. So really when we were looking at further study, we kind of wanted to focus in on maybe the aspect of the different types of loneliness. Obviously the length, being able to study people for longer, have much bigger groups. Obviously we get much more information that way. In further study we also wanted to look at the relationship between being alone and lonely. A lot of the time those words are kind of stuck together there. Oh, I'm alone, I'm lonely. And actually one of the amazing things we found is when we actually dissected it, asking these people the questions, often they would make the distinction themselves. Being alone is not the same as loneliness. And we really wanted to kind of look at the relationship between that, because there is one, we're not quite sure what it was. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.